All right, everyone, it's time to talk about Venezuela because things are progressing rather quickly there. Now, of course, a couple weeks ago, we have the next wave of the oil price collapse back to, I think, what was it, 50 a barrel. It finally crept up to like 65 or something, then it collapses again. It'll probably do it several times before it begins actually inching up over time. It may never hit its former highs. And for a nation like Venezuela, that has one major export, that's a bit of a problem. It would be like if you had a country and your only export was grain, and then the grain prices are reduced by, 2/3. Well, you're going to have some economic problems because then you have to significantly cut spending. Quality of life can drop. Your currency can hyperinflate. All of this is happening in Venezuela. Their currency is so worthless that literally the paper it's printed on for the old smaller denominations is worth more than the actual denomination. So they have to keep increase. It's like with the Yugoslavian money towards the end there, and they were printing like 10 billion notes and so forth. They're going to have to do that in Venezuela. But now you've got more political fallout. Before, a lot of the problems, they're really limited to the fiscal region. But as things continued not to improve, what happens is Maduro, he realizes he's not particularly popular. The legislature had a supermajority controlled by the opposition, not by Maduro's own party. He has to avoid even going into an election just to actually maintain his power. So what's his answer to the fact that the legislature is calling on him to step aside, hold an election, let's get back to business, try to figure out what we're going to do about a rather severe crisis here where 90% of the population is now living in essentially desperate poverty, minus the military and some of the bigwigs and the handful of private owners that still exist there. And smugglers, of course. Smugglers and pirates are starting to proliferate. So what are we going to do about this? Maduro says, I've got an idea. He has the Supreme Court there essentially dissolve the legislature. The legislative body in Venezuela, guaranteed and formed by their very constitution that Maduro himself signed on to years ago, and Chavez as well, that very body has been declared illegitimate now by the court system. The court, of course, being stacked with Maduro appointees. So essentially the judicial system of Venezuela is now also its legislature, and the actual assembly, the actual congressional body that exists there, is now powerless. Now that's why they're calling for street demonstrations and so forth. They're calling on these other nations to get involved. At this point, things are coming to a head in Venezuela, and they may begin to degrade very, very badly rather quickly. What before were smaller demonstrations put down viciously by Maduro may now involve the Venezuelan military getting directly involved. It is possible that the military there will say, fuck this, get rid of Maduro, install somebody else. Then you've got a whole different set of problems, by the way. What happens if some other strongman who just seems like they're honest, seems like a reformer, gets a hold, and Venezuela simply becomes a dictatorship? Well, if it becomes a dictatorship, it doesn't really matter whether it's under left or right-wing government now, does it? It doesn't really matter. The economy may do a little better or a little worse, but it's still a dictatorship. So now you've got a whole other set of problems, and then you've got another set of problems. Peru has now cut off diplomatic contact. The organizations there that Venezuela is a member of have either chastised them and demanded they hold an election or threatened to expel them. Venezuela is quickly becoming a pariah state that no longer has any actual allies in the American hemisphere, minus Cuba, which doesn't matter. Cuba can't prop them up. Raul Castro is not going to start sending a bunch of communist troops to Venezuela to try to quell insurrection they'd be completely laid waste to. Venezuela may end up collapsing so badly that it forces the involvement of the rest of Latin America. And it could happen very quickly. Their economy's in the shitter. It shows zero signs of improving. What tiny amount of improvement was made for a few months there was pissed away the second the oil prices fell away again. Because there was never any attempt to invest in any other form of infrastructure other than, hey, give people freebies. We've got oil money now, back when the oil prices were almost 3 times as high. That's all that happened. And it didn't work except to raise the Human Development Index, which is all well and good, but they frittered that money away. They made no long-term plans to diversify. Other nations have had this problem too. The OPEC states, which did in some cases, invest in other forms of economic capability. Some became like banking sort of cartel members, like for money laundering. Others, they invested in, high-tech research, something like that, like Saudi Arabia. Military designs, you think of Israel or something. They have a bit of oil themselves, and now gas, apparently off the Gaza Strip, that they probably want. With Venezuela, that was never a consideration. They've even taken people, and now, some time ago, I think it was like 2 months ago, they started commanding that people from urban centers would be sent to the countryside almost in a Pol Pot fashion to learn about farming and to help grow crops, just so there'd be something to eat. Essentially, starvation rations, subsistence agriculture. In the modern era, in a state that has more oil than anybody else, people are starving and have to practice forced, involuntary subsistence agriculture. Wonderful. They can't even keep the elephant in the one zoo that they have there in their capital well enough fed. So Venezuela has begun to collapse. This might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. It might be the last straw for people who are tired of Maduro. They may very well rise up in a sort of revolt. That doesn't, though, even if that happens, yeah, it's great that Maduro's gone. Okay, socialism's dead in Venezuela. You got all these other problems. You've got the problem of a state-funded guerrilla movement whose express purpose is to wage terrorism on any government that's not socialist that ever takes power. So there's that problem. You still don't have a diversified economy. There'd probably be a lot of injuries, a lot of problems there. And there's no guarantee that down the line it doesn't all happen again. So those are the problems of Venezuela. They have to entirely overhaul their entire system of government and establish virtually an entirely new culture to take care of even half of their problems. So it could get very, very messy very, very quickly. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully this legislative assembly gets enough people into the streets to force Venezuela to remove Maduro. Hopefully he goes, whether it's with or without a fight, hopefully he gets dragged off and they install a government there that's capable of reigning over an interim period before elections with some degree of order established. It won't take care of all their problems, but long term it would help stability. But the alternatives are it collapses into civil war, it gets invaded by its neighbors who are tired of dealing with this shit, it gets intervened in by the United States, in which case probably socialism ends up getting perpetuated there because of the great Satan sort of stuff that Chavez always used to ramble about, and Maduro does the same. And even old Raul, now that we're kind of sort of friendly with Cuba, even he is willing to make some wisecracks about like capitalism or something, just to keep up appearances. It's sort of long-standing tradition in some of these places. But it could get worse, far worse than it is now. Strange as though it may seem to think of a situation that could be worse than what's already going on in Venezuela, it could go into a total death spiral. So it's something to keep an eye on because there might be worldwide news. Right now, they're almost underplaying it. There's been a coup in Venezuela. Maduro has dissolved the legislature in a state that has more oil than any other nation. A rather large, fairly densely populated. It's not the most powerful nation in the world, but it is a nation in the world. It has a regional presence, certainly, especially in terms of energy and fuel and so forth. And almost nobody's talking about the fact that Maduro just essentially defanged the legislature by turning the judiciary into the legislature. And I'm seeing relatively little of this from any lamestream media outlet. Maybe they just don't want to talk about how bad socialism is, how poorly it fared there, how it's utterly falling apart and people are utterly miserable. Because years ago, under Chavez, when oil prices were high, Salon and all these groups, they say, oh, Venezuela, shining example of what socialism can be. Isn't it great? Human Development Index is skyrocketing. Literacy is rising. People have toasters, and they were like under slave labor, and now they're all getting rich. And now look at them. They're back where they started. It's worse than where they started. They would have been better off if they'd never even found that oil to begin with and stayed like a tribal region, arguably. So some plantations and a few towns and then a bunch of primitive individuals that still practice horticulturalism. At least they wouldn't be starving. That's what socialism does to you. Very, very temporary gains, and then it collapses everything. And those at the top, Maduro and all the others, they're the ones that benefit. He'd probably flee to some other country, bribe them to take him in, and he'd sit there in exile complaining about how the United States overthrew me. The United States did this and that, and it was so terrible, they screwed our people. And there'd actually be people dumb enough to believe that. That's about all. Peace out.